Everyone, and welcome to the 23rd meeting of the Rural Economy and Connectivity meeting. The meeting will be conducted in a hybrid format with three members, John Finney, Richard Lyle and Stewart Stevenson, and our witnesses participating remotely. Emma Harper, who is a member of in charge of the Dogs Protection of Livestock Amendment Scotland Bill, cannot participate as a committee member during the scrutiny of her bill. However, Emma will be joining us remotely today in her capacity as member in charge. I'd like to also welcome at the outset Christine Graham, who is joining us today as the committee substitute. Turning therefore to agenda item 1, which is the Dog Protection of Livestock Amendment Scotland Bill. The committee today is taking evidence on this bill, and we will hear from two panels today. There are a lot of questions to get through, so short questions and short answers always help. And before we go any further, I would just ask members if they'd like to declare any interest. And I guess Peter Chapman will want to declare one.
Yes, indeed. Convener, I declare an interest as a partner in the farming business.
Thank you. And I think Stewart Stevenson may also want to declare an interest at the outset. Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. I am the joint owner of a small agricultural holding, which is generally used for sheep grazing, and therefore it's relevant to the subject before us today.
Thank you very much, Stewart. And I, of course, should declare my interest as a member of a farming partnership. So I'd like to then welcome the first panel, which consists of now, I'm just looking here, Stephen Young, Head of Policy for Scottish Land and Estates, Charlie Adam, Vice President of NFU Scotland, and Jennifer Craig, the Chair of the National Sheep Association Scotland. We're going to move into questions straight away, and the first question, I have to remember who's up first. John Finney, you're going to be up first, so the first questions are from John Finney. John.
Good morning. Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel, and thank you for your written evidence. Just to perhaps kick us off, I wonder, could I hear from the panel what their assessment is of the scale and nature of the problem of livestock worrying and the most common circumstances in which it occurs? Maybe to Ms White first and then Mr Adam, please.
There you go. Charlie, you're up. No, you're still muted. Hold on just a moment. Start again, Charlie. We missed the first bit that you said.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I think the problem is probably more widespread than the evidence even suggests, because there would be quite a lot of unreported incidents. It's also, I think, increasing. We've had a survey done a couple of years ago which showed that 72% of our members had actually been affected in one way, and there's an increasing cost to the NFU Mutual in payouts. I think they've paid out £1.6 million in compensation. I think that figure relates to 2017, and there have been I think they quote a 67% increase in claims over a period. So it is probably fairly widespread and obviously varying in degrees of extent, but I would say also probably increasing, especially with increased access to the countryside at present.
Thank you. Who did you want
Ms.
to hear
White,
from?
Please.
Who did you want to hear from next? Sorry.
I wish to hear from Ms White, please.
Okay, and
yes,
I don't.
Thank you.
Yvonne, I'm not sure did I introduce you at the outset? I don't think I did introduce you on the basis that we couldn't see you because your camera was malfunctioning or there was a technical issue. So, Yvonne, excuse me for not introducing. You are the chair of the Scottish Crofting Federation, and the floor is yours, briefly, Yvonne.
Thank you. I would just like to echo that it certainly is on the increased dog worrying, and that it doesn't just affect areas near high population areas. It's also on the increase in rural areas in the Highlands and Islands, especially as more people are attracted to and take advantage of the benefits of the countryside, and that there seems to be an increase in lack of responsibility with regards to dog ownership, which is of concern. So this bill, amendment to the bill, is actually most welcome. And also the fact is that there are a lot more cases that happen, and it's not just sheep, it's also that I've had reports of calves and heifers being run over ravines by dogs off the lead. So it's just been, it's very much on the increase, and it's good that something's hopefully going to be done about it.
Thank you, Yvonne. Jennifer, would you like to come in on that?
Yes, yeah, thank you, Convener. Yeah, I would just say that, agree with what both the previous answers have already said, in that the problem is increasing, it's becoming more common. I think it has been severely underreported in previous years. Up until maybe the last 18 months, we have seen an increase in the numbers of cases that are being reported. They're certainly being covered more widely in the media as well, so it is coming more into the public attention span. However, there is, as Yvonne also pointed out, there is no specific areas in which these incidents occur. It is a nationwide issue that we have currently.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And Stephen, we ought to bring you in just as everyone else has had a chance to speak as well. And then back to you, John.
Thank you, Convener. Completely agree with what's been said so far, and there seems to be a growing issue. We've seen the kind of shocking images of injured animals, but it's actually the unseen costs sometimes as well. The abortions that are caused, damage to fences from cattle and being spooked. So there's all sorts of issues here, not just the kind of death and injury to animals. There's also the mental health and well-being issues for farmers themselves. But I think all these things and all the figures are really the symptom. The cause is really about irresponsible and reckless handling of dogs and animals. So really getting to the crux of that, getting people to fully understand the severity of their actions of not controlling their dog is really what the big issue is. And I agree with other panellists saying this is a widespread issue. It's not just sheep, and it's not just in certain areas and kind of near urban areas.
Thank you. John Finney. John.
Thank you, Convener, and thanks to the panel for these answers. As you say, for a lot of questions, so maybe I'll roll a couple together, if I may, Convener. I would like to hear from the panel about whether they believe, and I suspect, given what we've heard, that they may well do, that we can make an accurate assessment of how the problem should be addressed. Is there specifically a need for new legislation, and where are the gaps in existing legislation? And I think it was Mr. Adam that touched on the issue of underreporting. So I wonder if there are other measures, indeed non-legislative measures, which we could use to encourage report. So perhaps initially to Mr. Adam on that one, please. Thank you.
Charlie.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think there are a number of things which the bill, which we very much welcome as a step in the right direction, contains and suggests that could help with this. Obviously, one of them is simply widening the number of people who actually have powers to deal with issues when they arise, and therefore that would lead people to believe that if they don't control their dogs properly, somebody's likely to do something about it. I think in terms of underreporting, probably because the issue has been raised by this bill, people will be much more inclined to report. So that in itself is a valuable function. I think also changing the penalty regime to one which isn't just about fines would probably help, because in a situation where somebody can't pay a fine, if the penalty doesn't extend further than that, they may not have the same disincentive to do something about controlling their dog properly or be concerned about what the consequences might be if they don't.
And I think we'll come on to that specific issue a bit later. Jennifer, do you want to come in on that, followed by Stephen?
Yeah, I think I would echo what Charlie has already said. The lack of real repercussions for your actions in allowing your dog to commit any of these offences is an issue that we have. There is no deterrent to it. The penalties for it are, in some cases, non-existent or very, very lenient. You know, it's not just about the financial cost. However, a lot of people who do experience the more severe impacts of dog worrying, they do lose money because the compensation, the penalty is just not there. There is no incentive for people to ensure that their dogs are under control or behaving themselves. There is a general consensus that they will not receive any punishment, and therein is where we need the extra reinforcement and bodies who are able to implicate, whether it's fines for people who are repeat offenders, because in certain cases it can be the same people and the same dogs on a repeated situation, and generally nothing is ever available for a farmer to help tackle these people that are causing issues in their local areas.
Thank you. Yvonne, would you like to come in on that?
I do, as Mr. Finney asked, that is there a need for new legislation? That indeed, I think that there is, for various reasons. That, however, new legislation, any new legislation should not only be about it shouldn't be like just fines and imprisonment, though I agree with those being increased and used more widely. I hope I don't sound like I hang them and flog them type, but any new legislation should go hand in hand with an increase in education, starting in schools. I'm not sure how that would be done, obviously, but it's not ideal addressing the issue after the event. It's the cruelty to the animals involved, the stress to humans, the economic costs, that it's not really something that should be happening more and more in agricultural areas. And it is. So we really do need preventative measures. And when it does happen, that we need firm controls to prevent people doing it again. Jennifer raised the point about a lot of the time it's repeat owners, but it's the same owners, and that I've certainly had personal evidence of that, and also that's been reported to me through our members in the Crofting Federation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Stephen, do you want to come in on that?
Thank you. Yeah, I think there is a need for a change in legislation. I think we're looking at relatively old legislation going back to 1953, and the world has moved on quite a lot from there. The nature of farming has changed. The types of animals, camelids, deer, game birds are now being taken into consideration here. So it's just updating and modernising what's there already. In terms of other things we can do, non-legislative, I think education is really key here. I think, as Yvonne mentioned, clear messaging so people understand the severity of what's happening here. We quite often hear from people saying, my dog wouldn't do that, and not understanding the nature of how dogs work around livestock. I think we welcome the change in language in the new bill as well, changing from worrying to dog attacks. Worrying can be kind of brushed aside. It doesn't sound very serious, but I mean, we are talking about attacks here. So really just getting that messaging across to people and letting them understand the severity, but having that backed up by penalties if required. The people don't move on from being educated. So the repeat offenders, yes, definitely need that those penalties, but there's also others who just don't fully understand what the issue is. So it's a mix of education and penalties as well.
Thank you, Stephen. John, do you have any further questions?
Thank you very much indeed.
John, do you have further questions?
No, thank you. That's done. That's done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Stewart Stevenson, you had a follow-up question on that particular subject, I think. Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. As the answer is unlikely to influence how we respond to the bill, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but we heard in earlier evidence sessions that the two main breeds of dogs that attack are German Shepherds and Huskies. Now, German Shepherds, I understand there's a lot of them, but Huskies are a bit small. And I just thought I'll maybe just direct it solely to Jennifer Craig, in the interest of saving time, what the National Sheep Association's experiences of the breeds that are involved in attacking.
Jennifer.
Good. Yeah, thank you for your question. I think it's very unfair to penalise certain breeds of dogs. I don't think there is any evidence that certain breeds are more inclined to worry livestock than any others. It isn't particularly a dog problem, in my opinion, it's a people problem. You are responsible for your dog. Any dog breed has the ability to attack or worry sheep. And that therein is where some of the issue lies, is that people tend to think smaller, fluffier little dogs are less of an issue. However, they can actually do just as much, if not more damage than bigger dogs. So I really do feel that penalising certain dogs is no use.
Jennifer, thank you. And I'm glad we're not victimising any particular dog breed on this, because it could open us up to particular criticism from those breeders. Christine, you wanted to come in with a question there.
Yeah. Oh, does this come on itself, or do I have to press it? That's on. Can I just thank you for that response? I was the person who brought forward the Members' Bill on Control of Dogs Act, and that was a big move away from deed, not breed. So I very much welcome that, because, you know, a Jack Russell can do as much damage, if not more, sometimes than a big dog. So thank you very much. I think that's good to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Okay, and I see most panel members nodding in agreement with that. So I'm going to leave that hanging and move on to the next questions, which are from Richard Lyle. Richard, good morning.
Good morning, Convener. Thank you. I think a comment that was made by the member who is promoting the bill, this is not new legislation, it's actually updating 67-year-old old legislation. So good morning, panel. Do the panel members believe that this update in the law is necessary? And if so, why? And my question is to Jennifer Craig first.
Okay, Jennifer, you always seem to be coming in first at the moment, but off you go. We'll follow them by Stephen and Charlie. So Jennifer, off you go.
That's all right. Thank you very much. Yes, you make the very good point. It is legislation that's already there, but it certainly does need to be updated. As we have already mentioned, you know, the increases in the attacks that are happening, the increase in the worrying scenarios that we're in. So really, legislation that has been around that long, you certainly can argue that it isn't fit for purpose and it isn't covering the issue that we have now currently. So yes, it does very much need to be updated. For the sake of everybody, not just the farmers, not just the people whose livestock suffer these attacks, but also for dog owners, because most dog owners are responsible and they then end up tarnished with the same brush as those that are irresponsible, and they are the ones who need to be targeted by this legislation. Thank you.
Stephen.
Thank you. Stephen.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I think one of the main changes probably since 1953 is access laws. You know, there's been changes to access rights since then, so people are walking dogs in areas now where they probably wouldn't have then. So that's probably one of the most crucial changes. So this needs to keep up with that and match the access legislation.
Thank you. Charlie.
Charlie.
Thank you. I agree with what's been said. In addition, I think probably there has been a vast increase in dog ownership, particularly among the urban population, since 1953. And I also think there's been quite a large decrease in understanding among the general population of what happens in the countryside. So for those reasons alone, I would have said that clearly 1953 legislation is not going to be appropriate for the current time.
Yvonne.
Thank you for that. My next question to
Richard. Sorry, would you mind if I briefly brought in Yvonne, just to, as everyone else had a shot at it?
I was going to bring her in, and going to ask her to come in. My next question
Okay, Richard, Richard, you're in charge. You ask your next question. That's a very dangerous comment to make. Richard, you ask your next question, and Yvonne can go for it.
Yeah, I was meaning to bring you in the next question, Yvonne. So, Yvonne, good morning. Do you think the bill will reduce incidents of livestock worrying and increase prosecutions? Could it be improved to make it more effective in achieving both aims, Yvonne?
Will the bill reduce incidents? If the bill is implemented and resourced correctly, it would. It's very easy to pass bills and for bills not to be implemented, and to be implemented correctly, the resource needs to be there. So it would have the ability to reduce the incidents, but not itself, not as a standalone. And the second part of your question was about an increase. Would it help prevent an increase in incidents? Well, if education was part of it, and communication about the implications and the serious legal consequences arising from your dog indulging in attacking livestock, yes, it should. That would certainly put off some people, but we really do need to increase people's awareness and their sense of responsibility about having a dog. And I think Jennifer had said earlier that it's nothing to do with the dogs, it's the owners that are at fault. It's very few dogs are mad, mental, that they get like that they become like that for certain reasons. So yes, it will reduce incidents if it's properly resourced.
Right. Charlie, in regard to a question, a supplementary, convener. Charlie, in regard to the answer I've just got from Yvonne, in your experience, is it people who live in the countryside with dogs that cause this, or is it people who live outside the countryside who possibly come along to yours, to walk along an area on a sunny day with a dog? Well, what's your view on that?
I don't think I would like to make that distinction. I think probably it would be both. I would suspect that people who live and are used to what goes on in the countryside might be a little bit more aware of the dangers of what their dog might do, but I think it would be unfair to really make too much of that distinction. I think it's just about the attitude of owners to dogs. There are quite a lot of people from an urban area into a rural area, and some interest themselves and integrate themselves into country life more than others. So I think there's a degree of ignorance across the board.
Yeah. Okay, that's me, convener. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'll take back control there at that stage then. And the next question is from Angus. Angus, you've got some questions.
Okay, thanks, convener, and good morning to the panel. Further to Richard Lyle's theme there, we've heard Yvonne White mention education in schools, which was supported by Stephen Young. What education and public awareness efforts would your organisations like to see accompanying the bill? What public awareness efforts should be undertaken? And perhaps we could start with Yvonne, given that she's mentioned education a few times.
Thank you. I think that advertising, I think articles in newspapers, I think involving dog clubs, dog trainers in schools, that you can have special sessions that, include it in both primary and secondary school, in general awareness classes. I'm not quite sure if there's general awareness classes, but there'll be something that it fits into citizenship classes, environmental, along those lines. You've got radio, television, you've got social media. The Scottish Government must have quite a good machine for communicating. And it would actually be interesting that if there was a lot of focus put onto communicating this across all media to as many different parts of society as possible, to see what effects it has in reducing the incidents, the reported incidents, and it could even be used as a not a formula, but it could be used in other implementing other acts. So it needs to be really, I think, tied up with good, solid communication.
Angus, I'd like to go to Charlie Adam, and then I'd like to bring in Christine Graham and then come back to you on that. So, Charlie, do you want to head off on that?
Well, I would endorse everything Yvonne has said, and I think in general it's a sort of hobby horse really about education within the the normal education system of food farming and the countryside. I think that needs to be a great part of it. I think social media has a great part to play, but one other thought I do have is that most dog owners are responsible and are very proud of the fact that they handle their dogs correctly. So efforts amongst dog organizations to make it anybody who doesn't do that a black sheep, and make it one of these things which is just seen as a crime that brings everybody down among the dog owning community would be something we could do maybe in conjunction with those people.
Thank you, Charlie. Christine, you wanted to come in on this point, and then we'll go to probably either Jennifer or Stephen. Sorry, Christine.
I absolutely agree about the importance of publicity and promoting this, but this is a members' bill. And currently, from my own experience, the Scottish Government does not do the publicity. Now, the member would have to pay for it all themselves. So we've got the Minister coming later. So my question to the panel is, do you think that the Scottish Government should pick up the cost of publicising this amendment to the legislation if it goes through? Because I think there's no point in us doing it if the public don't know about it.
And I'm sure you'll take that up with the Minister when she's on the next panel. But an interesting point. Stephen, do you want to comment on education?
Yeah, I agree with everything's been said. I think there's without going off on a tangent on it too much, there is this a disconnect between urban and rural in a lot of matters, and this is just one of them. But certainly the Scottish Outdoor Access Code could be strengthened along these lines to make the messaging clearer. I think, and just going back to the last point as well, one thing that's been really heartening for me in this process is looking at the evidence from all sides. There is full agreement amongst all the bodies who've been given evidence in this SSPCA, Dogs Trust, the Kennel Club, National Sheep Association, National Farmers Union. Everyone agrees that this is an issue, and everyone agrees that something needs to be done. So the reach of all these organisations is potentially huge as well. So in terms of publicising the changes, I think we could have a real support from across the sector to do that. And I think there shouldn't be a huge issue in doing that, and we can include vets and things as well. So it is an important issue. Everyone sees it as an important issue, and I think everyone's keen to do something about it. So from that point of view, I think it is possible to do quite a lot of education that way.
Thank you, Stephen. And Jennifer, very briefly, and then I'm coming back to you, Angus.
Yes, thank you. No, I would agree with Stephen there that with the number of stakeholders that we have involved in this issue, there should be no reason why we can't all collectively work together to come up with some sort of education and publication that we can do. The solution to dog worrying is very simple. It is a 5-second decision as to whether you put a lead on your dog and keep it under control or not. It doesn't really need to be a lot more complicated than that.
Thank you. Angus.
Okay, thanks, Convener. I'll move on to my next question, if that's okay, and it's directed to Yvonne White with her SCF cap on, and I should perhaps declare that I own properties in a Crofting township in the Outer Hebrides. Can I ask you, Yvonne, if there are any particular issues to consider with regard to livestock worrying on crofts and on common grazing land? What do you think the bill will achieve from a crofting perspective?
I think the bill would achieve increased confidence in reporting incidents. At the moment, it was mentioned earlier about that it was thought a lot of incidents aren't reported. I know that there's not a lot. I haven't got any figures, but I do know where I am that there's most of the cases of dog worrying don't get reported. People see it as it's stressful. They're not quite sure about the process. Is it the police? Is it animal health? When the police do get involved, that they seem to have very little power. It involves taking statements, etc., because it's a crime and that's what happens. But if it's maybe to do with someone in your locality, and as you'll know, that traditionally it's been quite a close community and people don't like to say much negatively about their neighbours in the Highlands and Islands, and a lot of that still carries weight. So I do think that the proposed changes would increase the confidence in people reporting incidents, especially as now they're on the increase. And however, I do think that the reporting process needs to be very clear, and it needs to be seen to be working. At the moment, I know within the past year or two of cases that witness statements have been taken, etc. Nothing happened to the dogs. That the dogs went on to cause further damage, ending up the bits a human, and they're still wandering around. So I do know that years ago that if someone came to your door and said that, yeah, I think your dog's on the hill worrying, that people would just shoot the dog. But whether it was their dog or not, sometimes, because they didn't, because of the community aspect. But so yes, I do think I think it would help, and I do think in the Highlands and Islands that people need to be encouraged to come forward more with regards to livestock worrying.
Angus,
I hope
that's useful, Yvonne. I maybe, if I may, Angus, just bring in Charlie to say if he's got any experience from any crofting members that the NFUS has.
I don't actually have specific experience of crofting members, although I'm sure, particularly given the number of them in the area they're in and the tourism that happens in those areas, that those problems would exist. It did strike me, however, that from what Yvonne said, one of the things that is most important to this is that whether it's local authorities or police, that they are made aware of and encouraged to actually use the powers that they have available to them. NFUS has done a great deal of lobbying over that, but I think we could do a whole lot more. And obviously the resources that they have to do it, especially in these remote areas where, those sort of authorities may be very thin on the ground, that would be a particular problem in crofting communities, because you're going to be a long way from probably enforcement authorities in terms of both reporting and getting something done about it. Just a thought that came to my mind.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll move on to the next question, if we may. And the next questions come from Peter Chapman. Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I want to investigate dog control notices, and we heard in a previous session that witnesses noted that their support for the use of dog control notices in the cases of livestock worrying. And the NFUS has said that they welcome the use of DCNs in this situation. They say they're a useful interim step in the process. However, they can only be issued by an authorised person acting for a local authority, and they can't be issued by the police, for instance. So I just wonder that to the panel that, based on your members' experience, would increased use of dog control notices be a welcome tool to reduce livestock worrying?
Okay, Jennifer, do you want to head off on that, and then I'll come to Charlie?
Yep, well, thank you very much for the question. Yes, I would agree, and I'm sure the rest of our members would, that dog control notices would be a useful tool. It's, it is a way of trying to educate people, I suppose, in a way, once the incident has already occurred. I agree with what NFUS put in their response, in that, they need to be, really and truly, they need to be able to be handed out by the police as well as local authorities. There needs to be joined up thinking in order for them to be effective and to do what they would be intended to do. But as long as it was implemented properly, then yes, we would support them being implemented.
Thank you. Charlie.
The key
Hold
part
on,
of
sorry,
our
we missed the
on
first bit. Start again, Charlie. We missed the very first bit.
Just as Jennifer just said, sorry, thank you, Convener. As Jennifer has just said, that was a key part of the NFUS submission on this. And broadly speaking, whoever the inspectors might be, whether it be SSPCA, dog control wardens or whatever, and the police, I would say that these notices, or NFUS certainly would say these notices should be available to a wider range of people in order to increase the likelihood that they would actually be applied.
Okay, Stephen, do you want to come in, followed by Yvonne? Stephen.
Yeah, I think the wording Peter used is right. It is a tool in the box, as it were. I think we need a full range of resources in which to manage the problem, and I think they certainly are one that's there. And just similar to what Charlie was saying, we need consistency of approach. We don't want to have different approaches in different areas from different bodies. A big part of this bill is highlighting the severity of the issue, and it needs to be taken seriously, and everyone needs to take it with the same approach and the same penalties for the same offences. So that consistency of approach right across the board is what we're looking for.
Convener, can I
yeah,
ask a follow-up?
Sorry, Peter.
Just specifically to you, Stephen, I mean, the SLE raised the point of a national database of dog control notices to be established. And do you feel that this is something within this bill, that this should be part of this bill, that a DCN, a national database, should be put in place?
Yeah, I think that would be useful. I think it's back to that consistency and understanding and everyone being clear as to where we are with everything, so I think it would fit within this.
Okay. Thank you. Yvonne, do you want to add anything to that?
I've got nothing to add at all.
Okay.
Peter. My follow-up really is what would, do you feel that this bill should incorporate some of just what we've just discussed as regards dog control notices? I mean, is this something that this bill should actually address as part of its process going forward?
Who'd like to head off on that? Great, Charlie, I'm glad you put your hand up, because usually what happens is the last person to look away is the person that gets nominated. But as you've volunteered, Charlie, you're off on that.
Well, the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, fundamentally, what we're looking for is beefing things up so that things that have not in the past been an effective deterrent become one. And it seems to me that broadening the issue of these, albeit I agree with Stephen, it must be done consistently. This is one of the things that I think should be in this bill, because it will act as an increasingly effective deterrent compared with where we are just now.
One of the questions that came up last week, and just to ask if anyone's got any experience of this, I think it was Perth Kinross Evidence suggested they had 3 people that could issue these notices to cover the whole of their area. Seems very few people to cover a massive area. Do we need more people to issue? Charlie, you're volunteering with a clarity. So we'll go Charlie and then Yvonne.
Well, sorry, I don't want to leap in, brings up the whole question of resources. Fundamentally, it's no use having legislation if you don't have the people on the ground and the resources to actually get the job done. So I don't think that can be got away from. And obviously, this being a member's bill, there are limits as to what it can do in terms of that sort of thing, as I understand it. But that maybe does raise the whole issue of whether this is something that needs to be looked at through a different vehicle by government in order to make sure that those sort of resources and capacities are available.
Yvonne.
Yes, just to say that we waited approximately 6 to 7 months last year for a dog warden to be available to come from Inverness to look at a situation, so that there is a very real need for resources. And if the dog control notices can beef up the new legislation, yes, but I don't think they should be used instead of. They should be used as an integral part, and that there should be enough people to be able to issue them and follow up. It's the follow up that is really important in these matters, and it all comes back again to resources. But however, there's still a lot that can be done regardless of having the ideal amount of resource.
Thank you. Stephen, I think you wanted to say something, then we'll come on to Oliver Mundell and his questions.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It comes down to resource. One note of caution a little bit is if too many people get involved in the management of the issue, then it can create confusion. We need real clarity for people and victims of this as to what they do and when they are either is an ongoing issue or if there's an issue that they've seen, who do they phone and how do they deal with it? I think it was raised the other day in evidence by Alan Drawn, and I fully agree. Fly tipping is a good example where we've got the police involved, local authorities are involved, SEPA's involved, and people don't know what to do when they've got an issue and they end up phoning the wrong person, getting handed around the houses, and then they just give up. We want real clarity in this. I think that's, well, resource is key to it. We need to make it really clear how to report and who does what within this, and have real clarity as far as we can.
Thank you, Stephen. And we will now come to Oliver Mundell and his questions. Oliver.
Thank you, Convener. I know there's already been quite a lot of talk about penalties so far, but I just wondered whether, given recent legislation that's been passed in the Scottish Parliament, whether the panellists felt the penalties in this bill were still appropriate or whether they should be aligned with that in recent legislation.
I'm looking to see who's volunteering. Stephen, you looked away before anyone had a chance to ask the question. So you can start off and then we'll go to Jennifer and Charlie.
I was trying to scribble down the question. Yeah, I think we are keen to see stronger penalties, and in the extreme cases, then we could ask for stronger penalties within that. It's all fairly objective, but yeah, consistency across legislation would make sense. I would say, if it's across several bills with similar issues, then consistency would be good there. But yeah, there's definitely a need to strengthen penalties within this bill. And again, as we said, having a suite of different penalties available is important. And there is, a big difference between when there's intent and when there's repeat offenders, and we need to have really strong penalties to deal with them. If it's a one-off or another incident, then we need a softer penalty to deal with that as well. So having a full range is hugely important.
Okay, Jennifer, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just to be quite short and to the point, I would just agree with everything that Stephen has said and specifically echo the variances that we could have in fines or penalties, because as he rightly points out, you know, repeat offenders, then they should be targeted at a more higher rate. You know, accidents do happen, dogs get out accidentally. You know, we don't want to hammer somebody who has made a genuine mistake with a huge penalty. So yeah, perspective and clarity is definitely essential when it comes to the penalties.
Charlie.
Nothing to add. I agree with what's been said before, other than the fact, there's a point I made earlier, that people who don't have the money to pay a fine are not going to be necessarily deterred by a fine. So you need a range of other things that will hit home with them.
Oliver, I'll come back to you and then see if Yvonne wants to come back after that. Oliver.
That's super, and I think just that last point probably leads on to my next question, because I was interested in what the panellists' views were on compensation and whether that should be brought in as part of this legislation. We heard last week that you know, sometimes compensation is a sort of afterthought in the process, but given the value of livestock and the damage that's done, you know, is whether compensation should be dealt with as part of this bill.
And just to clarify, if I may, I think last week Stewart Stevenson bid me 300,000 for a tup I didn't have, but that was the sort of value that we were putting or could be put on a sheep, and therefore the issue of compensation is important. Yvonne, do you want to head off on that? Do you think compensation should be there?
I think 300,000 for a tup is obscene. That I would want it to do housework and and feed cows for that money. The compensation, it's difficult, isn't it? As Charlie mentioned, sometimes people haven't got the money. I think there needs to be something in the bill about compensation, whether it's in terms of public works, community service, or there needs to be something, because there's no point in putting in levels of compensation that people cannot pay. However, on saying that, there is significant economic effects to do with when livestock have been under attack from dogs. There's the stress to animals, and even if they're not fatally injured, a lot of the time they might abort, or they're just, you know, no good in future for breeding. There's vet bills, there's the time that's spent, and as I mentioned, the stress. So I think that there should be compensation in as a deterrent, but that there needs to be alternate means, because not everybody would be able to pay compensation. And it's also quite difficult, I would imagine, about how to set that compensation, because you could have a tup worth 300,000 and you would have another one worth 300. That's all I've got to say in that.
Okay, I think we'd all wish for tups to be worth that sort of money if we own them. Jennifer, you want to come in? Jennifer, I'm going to bring you in, and then Charlie, and then Stephen.
Yeah, thank you. I would echo what Yvonne has said there. You know, compensation is just part of the whole issue altogether. In most circumstances, it's more the upset that people are experiencing that causes them more distress than the financial situation. Although obviously if it's a large-scale incident, which we have seen in several places across the country, then there is the argument there is there for compensation. But if that, as Yvonne says, if that compensation can't be met, then it's irrelevant anyway, in a sense, by the offender. So it's a difficult one, the compensation one. And again, also, where do you pitch it? You know, do you take the farmer's valuation? Do we have to get independent valuations? You know, it could open up a whole can of worms. But I would agree that there should be some form of compensation, specifically in larger incidents where there is a big financial impact on the flock itself. Specifically for, quite often the larger impacts are on younger farmers or possibly new entrants or people who are generally not making a lot of money at the moment anyway. They don't have a lot of asset behind them. And for somebody like that, an incident could devastate their business. So yeah, compensation does have to be looked at some stage.
Charlie.
Well, I think the NFUS position on this is rather stronger. I mean, the fact is that we think that some form of compensation package for farmers is a key ask in relation to this, but we totally recognise that within the scope of a member's bill such as this, that may not be something that's possible to be dealt with, but it is something that needs to be addressed. The fact is, we don't all have £300,000 tups, but even cast ewes are making £100 at the moment. And in the normal level of profitability, even a relatively small amount of loss can be quite significant in terms of the viability and profitability of some people's sheep enterprises. So I would say it's very important from a farmer point of view that there should be some form of compensation package. And in terms of reporting too, clearly if there is no compensation available to people, it may well be that that is a contributory factor to under-reporting and therefore people who ought to be brought to book not being brought to book. Brought to book, should I say? Beg your pardon.
Charlie, just before we come to Stephen, can I just ask you a question on that? In the relation to stock, do most farmers have all their stock insured, or do they only insure the very valuable ones? I mean, will they be able to claim on insurance if something like this happens? Perhaps you could clarify that.
Well, I think most farmers, their commercial stock would not be insured. A pedigree, but certainly in my case, and most farmers, I think the premium rates are very high. I think the premium rate on something like a bull might be something like 18–20% of its value. So it is not economic to insure every animal. So that's not a viable option for normal commercial animals. And also, I mean, you come up against the fact that if you do make an insurance claim, if you have a policy, that is likely to lead to an increase in your premium. So again, with the size of individual claims that might come this way, there might well be a disincentive to make a claim, but it doesn't mean that a loss hasn't been taken.
Thank you for that, Stephen. And then I'm going to come back to Oliver Mundell for a supplementary.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you flip the scenario around, if livestock get out and trample through someone's garden, destroy their rose bushes and things like that, then they would expect to receive compensation for that. So turning the situation back, I think compensation for damage, which is very costly in some cases, does make sense, although there are, as you say, limitations around ability to pay. And I think that brings in the question of whether, insurance for dogs as well. It's a tricky area. I don't know how many have that already, but I know a lot of people pay insurance for the health of their dog to cover vet bills. Would a bolt-on to cover a kind of public liability type element of that be feasible? It's something that would need to be thought through carefully, but I think there's something there worth investigating further, I think, and I think that would be interesting to do that.
Thank you. Oliver, you wanted to come back in?
Yes, it was really to pick up on that last point, and it was whether any of the other panellists had a comment on certainly making that part of insurance for dogs, or a sort of compulsory element for dogs who are walked in areas where there's likely to be livestock. And secondly, on the compensation point, I have had pushback from farmers in my own area who push back on the figures talked about at this committee. But whether there could be a sort of standard compensation package put in place that looked at, sort of average values of livestock, because a lot of the people I've been speaking to feel it's the principle of compensation that's important, that people are made to give something back to the farmer, even if it doesn't reflect the full financial value. But the principle of compensation in itself is important.
Do you want to come? And then Jennifer, and then Yvonne. Briefly, Charlie.
Yes, thanks, convener. I think if that proves to be a workable thing, that makes sense. It does, obviously. A more practical solution would be to ask for or insist that people have insurance for their dogs against damage they may do. But whether that's possible or not, I don't know. I think that would be a viable solution. I certainly think that some form of compensation package is an important part of this from a farmer's point of view. I don't see why we should be less protected against the actions of others than other sections of society and other events.
Jennifer, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think I'll just add in that, yes, I think Oliver's right in his comment that it's the principle of a compensation package as opposed to actually being the exact amount of damage that has been inflicted. On the insurance point, I don't think it's a bad idea having a public liability attached to your dog's insurance. However, as with all insurances, there are caveats that put premiums and things up, and we'd have to be very careful as to how insurance companies would then implement these public liabilities. For instance, would certain breeds be penalised because they are perceived, and in most cases wrongly, to be more liable for actions that could result in a claim on public liability? So it could be a very grey area to disappear into, but it certainly is worth looking into for future purposes.
Thank you. And Yvonne.
I think the principle of compensation is a good idea, that you could have a sort of menu, couldn't you? The cost of a tuck, the cost of a hog, etc., etc. It would need to be updated annually, I guess, or maybe not, in relation to market values. But if it's just the principle of compensation, that maybe not. The insurance for dogs, I think most people have got insurance, haven't? Well, they've certainly got health insurance for dogs in towns. I know my friends have, and they seem to pay quite a lot of money. I know that for working dogs, when I asked NFU Mutual, that at one point I was looking into insuring one of our working collie dogs, just because he costs a lot of money, and that it was at that time, that was about 3-4 years ago, it would have cost £750 annually to insure the dog. And I know we've got 5 working collies, so and there's people with more and there's people with less, so you could end up penalising people with working dogs. If you had a blanket law regarding insurance, obviously most crofts and like farms are insured with the NFU Mutual. There's a plug there for the croft insurance and farm insurance, which gives you public liability cover. So I'm not so sold on blanket legislation for dogs, because I think you might a lot of crofters would end up and other people that couldn't afford it maybe in not a very good position. I think that would need further investigation, basically.
Thank you, Yvonne. And the Deputy Convener's reminded me that I should say there are other insurance companies out there, and that's not an endorsement. Along that lines, I'm not sure if that's entirely quite what she said, but Stewart Stevenson has got the next question. So good morning, Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. The issue of disqualifying people from owning dogs is one that's come up. Is it a proportionate and appropriate issue in this context? And what kind of offence, what kind of track record should people have where you would do that? And conversely, what mitigating circumstances should we properly be looking at in this context?
Jennifer, do you want to start on that? Jennifer?
Yep, thank you very much. Yeah, disqualifying people from owning dogs to me is it does seem very savage and sounds very severe. But there is a point that we are discovering with members that it is the same people habitually whose dogs are causing these incidents. They're worrying sheep, they're attacking sheep. In many cases, it is multiple dogs. So it's not the same dog every time. It's the same owner, but they may have 2 or 3 dogs and none of them are under control. Or they may have subsequently then attain other dogs and then the same problem happens again. Now, I would argue that part of being a responsible dog owner is that, you know, you have to keep them under control, you have to keep them safe as well as everybody around them safe. So if you are repeatedly causing a problem in your local area or even out with your area, if you take them for a drive to walk them, then you're not fulfilling your responsibilities as a responsible dog owner. You know, owning a dog is a privilege. You know, it shouldn't be a right. It comes with caveats to that. You owe that dog the best of your abilities to look after it. And I would argue that if you are allowing your dog to continue on a regular basis, or dogs, to cause concern, then you're not looking after them properly. And you're clearly not fit to be a responsible owner. So I would agree that there has to come a point in the most severe circumstances when other things are not working that, yes, we have to consider that some people just shouldn't be in charge of dogs.
Stephen, you wanted to come in on that, I think. Hold on, Stephen, I can't hear you yet. Hold on 2 seconds. Stephen, there we are. I think you're on now.
You've just missed the best point I've made all morning. Yeah, I think where there is intent in it and when there's repeat offenders, which is, as Jen pointed out, is the case in many cases, I think that it is the best way to go. And I think from the point of view of not of punishing the person, but we've got to look after the dog and be fair to dogs here as well. If you've got someone who is not looking after dogs properly, who is putting them in that situation, who is not treating them well, then it's causing danger and distress to the dog itself. So I think it's only fair on the dog, because the ultimate sanction is that the dog could get shot if it's caught in the act. So I think to be fair to the victim here, the animals, and to the dog itself, as well as punishing the owner, I think that deterrent should be there. But I think it has to be fairly serious cases in that respect, where it is repeat offences or intent.
Stewart, I'm going to come back to you because I think you've got a subsequent question to that, which we could then bring the other panel members in on. Stewart.
Right, thank you, Convener. We've had reference earlier in this session to access rights under the land reform legislation. So that opens up the question as to whether there should be a power to exclude people from walking on agricultural land. But of course, that raises the more general issue of how people with dogs know it's agricultural land. And I just refer to where I live in the country, that our field is agricultural land, but you only have to go a couple of 100 metres where the land, it isn't. It's actually an SSI. So it's not necessarily obvious to the townie. It might be more obvious to Stephen and myself and others on the panel. What's the views of the panel basically as to how that would work and what contribution that would make to reducing dog attacks?
And I'm going to go straight to Yvonne on that, because I think the demarcation there may be slightly more blurred than on more formal agricultural land. Yvonne.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't there, to stop people accessing land when we've got very good access rights. However, I think there's probably a case under certain circumstances. For instance, lambing. I've heard of, I know of cases that people have been lambing ewes and they've had people walking, this is in very rural areas before COVID, people walking close by them with a dog off the lead, and they've said, can you take your, move your dog, you're upsetting the ewe. And the response is we've got a right to be here. Yet if the people that they locked a gate because they were getting disturbed so much at lambing, they were in the wrong by putting a padlock on the access gate. So I really do think that given the increase in people coming into the countryside, which is a really good thing for the health, for health, etc., of people, but that a lot of people lack knowledge and experience, and that would need to be addressed by, it goes back to education again, but until everybody is a fully functioned, a responsible, mature adult about all these factors, that I do think that there's a good case to restrict people coming into areas where during calving and during lambing, and I think that would help. That obviously people would still do it, but so you could actually argue the ones that would still do it are probably the ones with the dogs that are going to cause the problem. So, however, I still think that it would be worth exploring.
Thank you.
Can I just
yep.
can I convene it just for others? Since access rights may only be exercised responsibly under the legislation, in other words, they're not blanket access, would it be automatically irresponsible for a dog to be off the lead near to livestock? I'm not going back to Yvonne, perhaps others who might want to answer, pick up on that aspect of this.
I was going to bring in Charlie, and then I was going to go to a supplementary for Christine Graham and come back to you, Stewart, if there's further. So, Charlie, do you want to say something on that?
Well, on Stewart's last point first, I think most farmers would actually totally agree that dogs not on a lead near livestock just generally is something that we think shouldn't happen. But obviously, the access code maybe doesn't go that far. So we're stuck with that. There's obviously a problem over education, clarity, and definition and enforcement in general banning of access to specific pieces of land, and where people are ignorant as to what's going on. It's very difficult to deal with that. But is where you have repeat offenders, and particularly where you have neighbours, and you can define the person and can define the specific piece of land that they are banned from going on, then I would have said in those cases quite clearly it should be possible to have a ban on access by a particular person, say a neighbour, to a particular piece of land. That should be fairly clearly something that can be set up and policed, frankly.
Christine, you wanted to come in.
Yes, a previous panel member raised an interesting point about the difficulty of defining things like rural land, field, crofting land, agricultural land, or indeed piece of land that you've just said. Would it not be better, getting a tangle about access here, to focus on the deed? The amendment really to the legislation is about, attacks on livestock. So rather than try to pin down the place, take that away and just look at wherever you are. It's not these difficult definitions. Any, attack on livestock will be an offence. Just make it that. I mean, I think you can get in a tangle about trying to define, let's say, field, for example.
Okay. And Christine, I'm just going to say, be very careful on the questions that you ask. Aren't going to be asked by another panel member who's indicated they wanted to ask on that specific subject. So, leaving that aside, I'll bring in Stephen and then I'll come back to Stewart. Stephen.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's very difficult. I heard the conversation the other day about how you define a field and an enclosure and things and that. I think because this is a human issue as well, it has to be really clear to people as to what's being expected and asked of them, and it's not a degree in geography or agriculture to be able to understand it. I think you're quite right. I think the Act is the important part, and I think language is really important. And in terms of the access code, it is the right of responsible access. It's not the right to roam. It's not just you can go where you want, when you want. You have to be responsible, and you have certain responsibilities there. So Yeah, no, I quite agree. And if you're in a field with livestock, I think the point was made the other day, the only way you really know that your dog is under close control is if it's on a lead. And that is the way of really simplifying the issue. So I think it's clear messaging, and it's making it as simple as we can. Yes, there are nuances and complications. I think that mixes messages and creates loopholes more than it solves. So I think you're right. If there's livestock in the field, then you have to be aware of it and be very clear what your responsibilities are.
And sorry, just before I come to the Deputy Convener with her questions, I just want to ask a question, the whole issue of putting dogs on a lead. I mean, for example, in May time, when young stock are going out into a field, walking across the grass field that they've just gone into with a dog on a lead, can actually create more problems than having a dog off the lead, because it attracts the livestock to the person that's walking across there. Do you think there's a whole education issue on that? Charlie, I'll come in on that and then come to Christine. To Maureen.
I absolutely do. I have personal experience where even when warned that there were stock in a field, somebody with a dog on a lead has insisted on crossing a field. And the fact is, as you say, that any farmer will tell you that keeping a dog on a lead in a field, say with cows and calves, what will probably happen is that the cattle will attack the dog, and because they're next to the person will get hit. And the advice to make for the nearest boundary, as I believe is in the access code, is not a safe thing to encourage people to think is going to keep them safe. It's actually an invitation to have people put themselves and their dogs. I think there are some flaws in the advice within the access code that actually endanger people's lives. And that's something that, in my view, ought to be changed.
Okay, Charlie, thank you. Sorry, I'm coming to the Deputy Convener now. Maureen Watt. Maureen, you've got a question, I think.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Can I just tease out the question of definitions a little bit more? I think, Stephen, in your submission, you did highlight the inconsistencies in the definitions between what's in the current legislation, well, the 1953 Act, and the Scottish Outdoor Access Code. So, are your views that we should, well, what are your views as to the best definitions that we should have in this proposed bill as opposed to what's gone before? Can we just tease that out a bit more?
Who would you like to go to, sorry?
Just anybody.
Okay, Stephen, do you want to start that one off?
I'm just trying to think. Can you give an example? Sorry, I'm just missing the point of your question a little bit.
Well, so I think in your response to the call for views, you said that there were inconsistencies in the definitions between the existing legislation, as you've already said, and the Scottish Outdoor Access Code. So, given that inconsistency, what, in your view, would be the best definitions to have in this legislation that we're discussing?
Stephen, you're...
I'm sorry, I'm having a complete mind blank on this just now.
Okay, well, maybe rather than put Stephen under pressure, does somebody want to... Charlie, do you want to go on definitions of where it's relevant in this bill as far as land is concerned?
Well, I have to admit, I'm not clear on the specific definitions that are being referred to, so I don't really know that I can really comment on that. I'm afraid.
Okay, maybe I can help. The section in the 53 Act is a field or enclosure, and it's the definition of field and enclosure, because certainly when you get into larger areas, I don't know, like the common grazings, it's not definable as a field. It's a huge area of hill in some cases. So maybe let Yvonne go a bit on that, and then I'll come back to you, Charlie and Stephen. I hope I've got that right, Maureen.
I could have done that.
Yeah. Hello? Yeah.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Right. Yeah. Definitely, I would say that the 1953 definition of a field or enclosure would need updated to cover the full gambit of agricultural land. As it's just been mentioned, that common grazings there's common grazings areas of 7,000 acres, which are unfenced. So a field is obviously defined by set boundaries, usually physical, as would an enclosure, and the common grazings boundaries tend to be, their boundaries are geographic rather than human-made, i.e. fences.
Charlie, do you want to come in?
So you could...
Sorry, let's see. Can I bring Charlie in? I'll come back to Yvonne straight after. No, I'll come back to Maureen straight after Charlie, and then you may get another chance to come in. Charlie, do you want to go on that?
Well, I'm a little out of my depth in terms of the subject, but it does seem to me that there comes a point where it is almost impossible to define a piece of land. And obviously thinks of hill sheep and people walking around on mountains where there are black EUs around. And so it does seem to me that at a certain point you have to address the whole thing with general rules on behaviour rather than trying to specify specific pieces of land. Where do you draw the line between what is and what isn't an enclosure? I think that's a very difficult one.
Maureen, do you want to?
So, am I getting the sense that, as Christine kind of came in on her intervention, that it should be about the deed rather than the place, that it's just too difficult to talk about, to define places, therefore we should just look at the deed?
Record, I'm seeing 4 very clear nodding heads. Is that sufficient for you, Maureen?
That's fine, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll take that as a yes from all of you. And the next questions are from Mike Rumbles. Mike.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I want to concentrate on Section 5 of the bill, which is about inspecting bodies and inspectors. And it says in the bill about authorising inspecting bodies and appointment of inspectors, it says, the Scottish ministers may by regulations authorise one or more persons, organisations or bodies to appoint inspectors for the purpose of this Act. Now this is quite different approach to the approach in the 2006 Welfare of Farmed Animals Act, where the Scottish Government appoints inspectors to assist the police, as an addition to the police. So my question to the panel is really, do you think this is the best approach, that we can have organisations appointed by the Scottish Government who then appoint their own people without any necessary reference to the Scottish Government?
Who'd like to head off on that? Stephen, followed by Charlie.
Yeah, I think we covered it a little bit earlier on, the need for consistency and clarity for everyone as to who's involved. I think things could get really muddy very quickly and really confused if there's too many people involved. And I agree, if different people are appointing different bodies, then you can get inconsistencies on the way things are interpreted, the way things are forced. So I think it's really important that we do have that. And we've seen across local authorities as well, they put different emphases on things, have different amounts of resource. So I think things have to be as consistent as they can be across the country. And as I say, that being very clear who's ultimately responsible is important. And I think I would be keen to see it kept as tight as possible. But although we need the resource, so it's walking that fine line, so having the resource to deal with this, but making sure that there is that consistency.
Charlie.
Yeah, well, as Stephen has said, there's obviously a conflict between achieving consistency and getting enough people on the ground to actually have an effective enforcement and body of people. The only suggestion that comes quickly to mind would be that whereas people might, as individual organisations, find their own people, that there would need to be some sort of central training or course or whatever that those people had to go through to ensure that they were all singing from the same hymn book when they then went out on the ground in order to do the job. That seemed to me might be a compromise, because in the end of the day, we need people on the ground in sufficient numbers to actually have some deterrent effect.
Jennifer, would you like to come in on that?
I think the two panellists before me have covered that as far as I would go. I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Mike.
Yes, thank you. So the view of the panellists basically is that it would be sufficient for organisations to appoint inspectors as long as they were trained and perhaps certificated, so that have the same standard as what we expect. But my other question would be then, if that was the case, because at the moment there's nothing in the bill to say that that should happen. At the moment, the bill just says the Scottish Government can appoint an organisation to appoint people. So if this bill wasn't changed, who do you think those organisations would be? What sort of who do you think these organisations would be authorised by the Scottish Government to appoint their own inspectors?
Very quickly, we'll run around the table, if I may, Mike, and ask each of the witnesses to give a couple of organisations they think might be the person. Do you want to start off with that, Jennifer?
I'm not sure I really have an answer, to be truthful, as to how or who those organisations. I think you should just pass it to somebody else.
Okay, so I can't see everyone else, so I can't see who's looking away to avoid the question. Let's take a pick. Charlie, you're there. You've volunteered before first. Off you go.
Well, I'll have a go. I mean, well, the obvious one would be SSPCA, local authorities, whether any agricultural organisations themselves might be able to do that. I don't know. I feel it's more important that whoever is picked by whoever, as we said earlier, is trained and consistent and knows what they're doing. And perhaps people could be nominated, and then if they pass muster, I don't know. It's all that important who nominates them. I don't know. Sorry, I'm waffling a bit because I'm not all that clear, but
Mike,
there are obvious ones.
Mike, are there any people that you think that should be on the list, for example, and then maybe the panel could say yes or no?
Convener, I don't want to lead the witnesses. I don't want to put my words into their mouths. It's interesting that so far there's a lot of confusion about this, and so I'd like to hear the other contributors.
Okay, Stephen, followed by Yvonne.
Yeah, and thanks. I think we need to be really careful here. I think there are a lot of bodies who could potentially do it, but I think a big part of this bill is about defining and clearing up the severity of the issue. And I think we're in danger of being viewed as watering it down again if it then gets handed down the line to other people. So I think the police need to be ultimately responsible for the enforcement of it. And I think they have the resource to do that and can do. I think in their evidence session, I think I'm right, I need to check, but I think SSPCA said they would struggle to do it just on the basis of resource. So I do think we need to be careful that we don't just hand this down the line to different people, and we have to be really clear. And as I say, the big part of this is really underlining how severe this problem is and how important it is to deal with. So I think we have to keep that paramount.
Yvonne, very briefly, if you'd like to come in, if you don't want to say anything, happy.
I think that it can be a budget issue that if too many organisations are appointed or who haven't got the budgetary wherewithal, the whole thing would fall over and we wouldn't be any further forward. That probably at the start it would be better to have that option, but to keep it tight, to keep it with the police, especially as someone said, they do have the budget or would have the budget to implement this. And I think one of the points is, a main point is that it needs to be clear with the complainant, with the victim, if you like, who is responsible and who you can complain to. Unless that there was a very good degree of clarity, the people would actually become very confused. Who do they go to? SPCA, the local authority, etc. At the moment, I don't think people are that clear, so it would make it less clear.
Mike, I'm going to come back to you in a minute because Oliver's got a supplementary on that particular point, and I know you've got another question. Oliver.
Yeah, no, Convener, I was really picking up on the point Stephen made. I'm concerned, it might be a reality, but I'm concerned that the offset, if we're saying that the offence is not serious enough for the police to deal with it and investigate it. And I just wondered whether Charlie and Jennifer shared that view as well, that it was important for people living in rural communities to know that the police were well enough resourced to deal with what is a very serious issue for lots of farmers.
Okay, Jennifer, do you want to head off on that and then come back to Charlie?
Yeah, thank you. No, I would agree with that. Short and to the point.
Okay, Charlie. You can follow that.
I would agree too, but can I just say that I think there is a feeling that the attitude of the police to this sort of offence as against to some other wildlife offences maybe isn't consistent, and that does indicate that in their eyes perhaps the police need to be more aware themselves that a wildlife crime and a sheep worrying incident are both severe incidents that need to be taken extremely seriously. I'm not sure that at the moment that would be the approach. One feels the police are extremely strong on acting against wildlife crime and the penalties that go with it, but that isn't reflected to livestock worrying on farms and crofts, in my view.
Mike.
Can I just ask this question to make sure that I'm completely understanding our four witnesses? I've taken from the responses that there's a feeling that this is a serious crime, and that if people don't know, if there's a disparate number of people or organisations involved in tackling this crime, it might add complications to the whole process. And I'm trying to interpret what the evidence has just said, and just correct me if I'm wrong. There seems to be a view that actually it might be better for the police to take total control of this and to have it beefed up and make sure they have adequate resources to deal with it. Because it seems to me a question of, I mean, I'm taking what Charlie's been saying about resources. If the police don't have the resources to do this, it won't be done properly. And some organisations like the SSPC are saying they don't have the resources to do it. So it's really about resources and clarity of responsibility. Am I right in saying that?
Can I just ask if anyone disagrees with what Mike's saying? I'm happy to bring them in, but you all seem to be nodding. Have I interpreted that correctly? Yes. Stephen, you're not nodding. You are nodding now. Okay. So we have interpreted that correctly. Just then, before I go to Emma to ask some questions, whose bill it is, in the evidence I was reading last night, one thing that it was suggested that if in the strange situation, and it can occur where a dog has escaped from a garden and comes back covered in blood and with wool between its teeth, where it has clearly been involved in livestock worrying, whether the owner should have a responsibility to report that to the police. And I think that, Stephen, was from the SLE's evidence. Do you think that if something like that's happened, it should be incumbent on the owner to inform the police this may have happened and they may have the responsible dog? Who'd like to head off on that? Yvonne, do you want to go on that?
Yes, I think it's just akin to a road accident. If you run over a sheep and it's still alive, that there's that animal welfare issue involved. The sheep could still be alive. Obviously, it might not be that dog because it could just have come across the sheep, and you know that it could have been another dog. So you can't jump to conclusions without without evidence. But I do think for animal welfare purposes, it should be reported because there could be an animal in pain that needed treated, put down probably. Yes, so it should be reported to the police.
Okay. Does anyone else want to come in on that? I'm not seeing any. Well, Stephen, I'll bring you in, and then I'd like to come to Emma, whose bill it is. So, Stephen.
Yeah, just very quickly. Totally agree. I don't think it's just on that case of the dog coming back into sight. I mean, there are some cases where people have seen their dog chasing sheep and maybe not killing them or injuring them visually, but some of the other issues, and that's where reporting becomes really important so that people can inspect them and find out what issues have been caused, which might not be apparent immediately. So I think it's all coming back to this pattern of responsible ownership and responsible access. These are the sort of things you do, and these are your responsibilities within that. So I think it would be useful to include that.
Thank you for that, Stephen. Emma, I'm going to bring you in for some to ask a couple of questions if you'd like. So good morning, Emma, and off you go.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody, and good morning to my colleagues at the other end. Just a quick question, really. I think it's really important that I do thank the witnesses and welcome their input, and also members for scrutiny of this Members' Bill. And I take on board resourcing, compensation, and the need for continued education, and indeed not place. I'm wondering if the witnesses think that the bill does propose flexibility for the Crown Office to assess individual livestock incidents, because we've heard of one dog having a simple chase and folk thinking that's a bit of fun. And I've also had real extreme cases that have came forward where 15 sheep were killed and mutilated and needed vet's attention, sutured on site and things like that. And there's been one case in particular where a repeat offender just couldn't care less, and it was as if he would be quite happy to go and let his lab do it again. So I'm wondering if they think that the bill is flexible enough to allow the Crown Office to have an approach that would address individual incidents.
Okay. Who would anyone like to pass comment on that? Stephen, do you want to go? Or Stephen or Jennifer, because you're on the left of the screen. I don't know how that's popped up, but that's the way it is.
Yeah, I mean, keeping it brief, yes, I think there is flexibility. I think there is a real suite of actions there. So I think there is, yeah. I think that's well covered. And as you say, there's huge differences between scenarios, and that there has to be that flexibility there.
Jennifer, do you want to say anything there?
Yeah, I would just agree that there is flexibility in the bill and that is essential going forward, as we've pointed out already.
Okay, Charlie, I think you're wanting to come in there.
In agreement with the previous two answers from Jennifer and Stephen, I think there is the flexibility there. Yeah.
Okay, and in fairness, Yvonne, you can agree as well if you like, or not.
Yes, I agree.
Okay. Emma, are there any other questions that you'd like to put to the panel?
Just a final question, Convener. Charlie brought up the issue where maybe there wasn't consistency with the police in maybe taking the offence of attacking, chasing, worrying livestock very seriously. And so recently, the Scottish Partnership Against Rural Crime have done a lot of awareness raising, but there's been Take a Lead SNH campaign, which is now Nature Scotland or Nature Scot, and Farmers Guardian as well. So do you think that the increasing awareness that has been completed by Spark and others has helped raise awareness so that we can use this legislation along with education as well to make a difference and reduce incidents of livestock worrying?
Charlie.
The difference, well, NFUS has lobbied on this over years, but I think it is getting a lot more attention now, as ever with things coming from the agricultural side. The difficulty is getting that information away from the farming community and the farming press and into the wider media. It's always a difficulty we have, and it's an issue with the press, frankly, just reaching the people who need to be reached. And the choice of medium to do that is something that I think we need to pay close attention to. We do actually have vehicles now, especially with social media, that we didn't have before, which I think have helped a great deal too.
Jennifer, do you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, the campaigns have, I think, been working well. There seems to be a good awareness. They seem to be shared very well. But I think, you know, we definitely have more to do, and other organisations need to look at joining up that thinking as well. Okay,
and I'm going to give you each a chance. So I'll come to Yvonne and then to Stephen.
All the communication in the area must and has helped raise awareness. With regards to the consistency of police, especially maybe in rural areas, I think that the people that I've come across that have talked to me about this, that they actually haven't got that much faith in the police with regards attacks on livestock, because the times that evidence and statements have been taken, even in repeated cases, by that I mean same owner, same pack of dogs, nothing's happened. So maybe with regards to, and what I don't want to be sort of too negative here, but it's good that there's sort of education for the police as well. I think maybe in rural areas the police have got, and quite rightly in a way, or understandably, they don't want to upset people. So they might be more inclined to give people more chances than they would in an area of higher population, especially as a lot of them live within the area, and some have gone to school with maybe the people that, well, that doesn't sound very good, does it? That have gone to, they're more interlinked. They're more interlinked with the community. So maybe don't take such an objective view, maybe. I don't know, that's just anecdotal, obviously. So I think that there needs to be something, there is something around consistency of police response with regards to attacks on livestock. And it needs to be as serious, as Charlie mentioned earlier about other wildlife. It's very serious, and it's a matter of animal welfare as well as a stress on the owners and the victims.
Thank you, Yvonne. And finally, I'm going to come to you, Stephen. Stephen.
Okay, yeah, I think there has been a lot of good work so far done in the raising awareness, and the fact that we're having this conversation now is kind of testament to that, how this has kind of come up the agenda. I think there's been good work done by Spark. I think National Access Forum discuss it fairly regularly, Nature Scott as well, but there's still a huge amount of work to do, and I think this bill will give a bit of impetus to that. It gives strength to it. In terms of consistency from the police, I don't have any evidence on that specifically. There's one or two anecdotal bits, but I think Yvonne's right, the education of police as well as the public as well, and the seriousness, and this giving them stronger powers will enhance that as well. So I can only see this being an improvement for all of these things.
Thank you very much for that, and I think that brings us to the end of this evidence session. I'd like to thank Stephen, Charlie, Yvonne and Jennifer for the evidence that they've given this morning. And I'd also like to thank the person who has now joined me as the only person to have received a call of a call at volume during a committee meeting. So whoever it was will remain nameless, but I am the other guilty person during this term of the committee. So thank you for joining me, whoever that was. And I'm now going to suspend the meeting till 10:45, and thank you again to the panel for the evidence that you gave this morning. Thank you. Welcome back to this session of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee, and I'd like to welcome the second panel from the Scottish Government. Could I welcome Mary Goujon, the Minister for Rural Affairs and the Natural Environment, Phil Burns, the Policy Manager for the Animal Welfare Branch, Jim Wilson, the Head of Safer Communities and Justice Directorate, the COVID Hub. Minister, you want to make a brief opening statement, so off you go.
Okay, thank you very much, Convener, and thank the committee for having me to give evidence on Emma Harper's bill today. And I'm really pleased that Emma has introduced this bill to the Parliament, and we are happy to support the general principles of it. And that support's given under our commitment to facilitate all methods to better address the finding of more effective ways of preventing such attacks on livestock and of minimising their impact. And the Scottish Government believes that the welfare of all animals is extremely important, and it's therefore right that steps should be taken to ensure the highest levels of protection. Now, we're all of the view that the current penalty of £1,000 under the Dogs Protection of Livestock Act 1953 doesn't address the seriousness of the consequences surrounding livestock attacks and worrying. And the current penalty no longer affects the value of livestock either that are unfortunately harmed in this sort of incident. It doesn't provide cover to all of the species that are now farmed almost 70 years after the original Act. And the proposed increases take into account the increased mobility and leisure time that we all enjoy now, but one unintended consequence of that is that there is a higher risk of interaction between livestock and dogs. And we're aware of the incidences of worrying and attacks to livestock. These carry a high welfare risk to livestock from both the chasing and the harassment, also from the causing of occasionally fatal injuries. And we're also aware of the frustration and the emotional distress that worrying and livestock attacks causes to livestock farmers. These feelings can have as much impact on the livestock keeper as the financial costs entailed through time lost, through veterinary costs, the replacement of lost animals and disruptions to breeding programmes. The livestock industry is vitally important to our rural and remote rural communities, and we have to take measures to ensure that they're appropriately protected. The Scottish Government considers that owning an animal comes with responsibilities, not solely for the owned animal, but also for other animals that that animal may come into contact with. All dog owners should be reminded that their dogs must be kept under effective control in all places to avoid incidents of attack and worrying. We recognise that the majority of dog owners walk their animals responsibly in all environments and understand that owning a dog brings many responsibilities, but sadly some don't exercise an appropriate level of control. The bill proposes the introduction of additional controls on those convicted of livestock offences, and we consider these controls, which are designed to limit reoffending and harm to livestock, will be useful measures to reduce reoffending. However, we expect the detail of these provisions to be considered in greater detail throughout the bill process, and we may then accordingly seek amendment to address any issues that are identified with the bill as introduced. And we would highlight at this stage that the proposed new powers for inspectors and for constables and the new post-conviction powers will require particular consideration to ensure that they strike the right balance in the investigation and prevention of attacks on livestock.
Thank you, Minister, for that very detailed introduction. And the first question is from the Deputy Convener, Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Morning, Minister. I think in your opening statement you have perhaps covered this, but what would you say are the key reasons why the government are supporting this bill?
The key reasons why we are supporting it are the fact that we are, in relation to the legislation that we currently have in place, it's nearly 70 years old now. So that's one of the key reasons why we support Emma Harper's bill, because it really modernises that legislation. And the new penalties that are introduced, I think, better reflect the seriousness of the crime that has been committed. And obviously the welfare of all animals is extremely important to us. And I think that this bill also fits in well with the other work that we've been taking forward. As members of the committee will be aware, we recently passed the Animals and Wildlife Act in June of this year. So I think this reflects some of the work and fits in well with the work that we undertook in that legislation to really strengthen and modernise the legislation that we have concerning the welfare of our animals.
Okay, thank you.
Minister, and the next questions will be from Richard Lyle. Richard.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Minister, in your view, where does the introduced bill fit with other legislation on dogs and animal welfare, including the Control of Dogs Scotland Act 2010?
As I just mentioned in my previous answer, obviously we've been taking forward work on act that we took forward just a few months ago. But the key pieces of legislation that really interact with Emma Harper's bill are the 1953 Act. That was the one I mentioned in my opening statement. Again, it's nearly 70 years old now. And that's what criminalises dog owners when a dog worries livestock. And the other key piece of legislation that this interacts with as well would be the Control of Dog Act 2010. And this one is quite distinct from, obviously, from the 1953 Act, because this is a civil enforcement regime rather than a criminal enforcement regime. It can be in relation to dog control notices, which can be issued. The criminal element only comes into that if dog control notice is breached. But as I say, other than that, it is a civil enforcement regime. And in relation to the issuing of dog control notices, there are two tests which have to be met if a dog control notice is to be issued. And I think while the key aim of that piece of legislation was to prevent the behaviour of dogs getting to a stage where they could attack an individual, say, and it's seen as more of a preventative measure, it can also be used if an attack has taken place, so it can be applied after an event has happened as well.
Richard.
Thanks for that. The 2020-21 programme for government states that the Scottish Government plans to consult further on the law on dangerous dogs. Will this be a comprehensive review of all legislation around dog control, or will it address specific pieces of legislation? If passed, would this bill be within the scope of such a review?
Well, I believe that review is due to take place towards the end of this year. So in terms of the scope of what this review would be looking at, in particular, it would be considering the Dangerous Dogs Act 1991, because I think that was one of the key concerns that had been raised by the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee. So it really will be focused on that. And particularly because I think we've all faced challenges in each department in relation to resourcing, and I think that's why that piece of legislation would be the key focus of that review that's going to take place. And as I've said, that will be taking place towards the end of this year. There will be a consultation on that. And the consultation will really be focused on looking at responsible dog ownership, where that impacts on the safety of people. And it will also include issues such as seizure powers under the 1991 Act and dog walking companies and how the law impacts them.
That's fine. That's me, convener. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much, Richard. Colin, I think you've got some questions now. Colin Smith.
Thank you. Thank you very much, convener, and good morning to the panel. A number of witnesses have raised the issue of a more effective use of dog control notices when it comes to cases of livestock worrying. So I'm just keen to know the Minister's views on that, and in particular, one of the issues that has been raised is a lack of resources towards their use. Local authorities are obviously the ones that use the notices, but they are currently under-resourced. So I'm keen to know your views on the need for more resources, and also should they be extended to Police Scotland being able to use them in cases of livestock worrying?
I know that this is a point that has been raised in previous evidence that's been given to the committee in relation to should police have the ability to give dog control notices. I think I'd be hesitant to confirm that that's a power we would want them to have. I think that we would have to have discussions with Police Scotland about that, whether that was a power they felt would be appropriate, because I think it's also important to remember as well, so through the work of the Public Audit Committee, where they were looking into the Control of Dogs Act 2010, there has been a whole host of work that's gone on as a result of the committee's scrutiny of that piece of legislation. So part of that, there was a consultation that was held from September last year to January this year, and that was really looking at the issues around dog control notices. Should there be a national database for that? And there are various pieces of work that the government is taking forward as a result of that. In relation to the point that you've made about resources, I think this isn't just a question about resource, because I think it's about looking how well authorities are using the powers that they have already. So I don't think it's as easy a suggestion as just saying that there's problems that resourcing would necessarily fix. Because I think if you're to look at some of the figures when it comes to the issuing of dog control notices, and I think this was one point that was borne out by the scrutiny of the committee, is that there was quite a big discrepancy between different local authorities, and that didn't always necessarily correlate with the resource that had been in place. So, for example, some of the figures that I have, so if you looked at Glasgow City Council, for example, between 2019 and this year, they have 2 dog wardens in place. They've conducted 57 investigations and issued 4 dog control notices. And then on the other hand, you have Angus Council, who have 1 dog warden, conducted 287 investigations and have issued 22 dog control notices. And I think Fife Council is another example of where they've been able to use the legislation and have worked that really well, and they've been able to allocate the resource to put into that and the training of the dog wardens. So again, it's not as straightforward as this is just a resource issue. I think it's about looking at how is the legislation being used? Is it being used to best effect? And as I said, there are also a number of other pieces of work looking at how the relationships, say, between local authorities and the police and the joint protocols between them and how they work, whether that's an area that can be improved. And there is a working group which was the Scottish Government, local authorities, Police Scotland, and there are other members represented on that as well, looking at how there can be better working and what measures can be taken to really improve the effectiveness of the legislation. So I hope that answers the question. I don't know if Jim wants to come in or add anything to what I've said.
Well, I'm going to come back to Colin, if I may, and then maybe there's a chance for him to come in then. Sorry, Colin.
Just following up on that, Convener, does the government have a view as to whether or not there are any changes needed in the actual legislation? I mean, is this bill an opportunity to change the legislation on notices to improve their use, or is it primarily non-legislative measures that are required?
It probably wouldn't be the appropriate place to do that right now, because I think that, as I said, there is the working group that's set up to really try and tackle and address all of these issues. So I think it would be probably more appropriate to allow the working group to work through those issues, as well as and focus on some of the points that they've already found and some of the issues that were raised in the consultation that was done late last year and at the start of this year. So there is a lot of work ongoing. So I think that it wouldn't be the appropriate place. It's probably a bit too soon to look to include any of those measures within legislation, because I think that will be a wider part of the work as well. It'll be looking at, well, is there anything that needs legislation, or are there other ways that we can look to try and address some of these problems?
I cut Jim off as he was about to launch forth, and so I want to give him a chance to come in, if I may, to add to the point that he was going to make. Jim.
Thank you very much, Convener. Just to answer the Minister's comment, just in relation to local authorities' spend, it's worthwhile highlighting the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee did actually seek some information about the amount of resources and money that was actually being spent by each of the local authorities across Scotland in relation to dog control. So we have actually engaged the Society of Chief Environmental Officers to actually seek information from each of the local authorities in order to respond to that committee point. But more generally, just following on the Minister's comments around the working group, it's worthwhile adding that we are actually proactively looking to achieve some quick wins. So the statutory guidance that accompanied the Control of Dogs Act 2010 is currently being reviewed, and that's with a view to actually publishing an updated guidance document by the end of this year. The joint protocol document between
Police Scotland and local authorities, which was last published in May 2016, is also under review. And again, we are aiming to publish the actual joint protocol document by the end of this year. And just in relation to the working group membership, I think it's quite key to point out that we recognise, certainly within the Scottish Government, that when we look at issues of the control of dogs and responsible dog ownership, of course that strays into a number of portfolio areas. So it is quite key not just to have some of the key enforcement agencies such as Police Scotland and local authorities and others that form that working group that will engage regularly with Scottish Government, but to also have that close connection between justice and safer communities policy and also animal welfare policy as well. So it was just to confirm that we do have an animal welfare presence actually on the Scottish Government-led working group.
Thank you very much, Jim. Colin, I think you're happy with those answers. Going to move on then to the next questions, which are from Stewart Stevenson. Stewart.
Convener, and I just want to explore a little bit about disqualification orders and their use, and to ask the Minister basically what circumstances these might be appropriate in, and indeed what mitigations might apply to ensure that they're not. And would it be the government's intention, or perhaps the Lord Advocate's intention, to provide guidance as to how the courts might operate the way that disqualification might be applied?
Minister.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a couple of points within that. I think in relation to the guidance, it would be up to the Scottish Sentencing Council to provide any guidance in relating to sentences on that. I know that during the course of the Animals and Wildlife Bill, we'd look to contact the Scottish Sentencing Council to do exactly a similar thing there. I know that they have quite a full work programme at the moment, but I think that's a point that could well be raised with them to see if they were willing to consider and look at that, because obviously they are an independent body and that wouldn't be up to us to dictate that. So that is definitely a point that could be raised with them. In relation to the disqualification orders and the appropriateness, we believe that a disqualification order against the ownership of a dog would be appropriate where a court considers that the offending owner isn't able to, or they've just decided that they're not going to control their dog around livestock, and especially where that can present a danger to other animals and potentially to people as well. But again, in relation to the appropriateness of any sentence, that would ultimately be up to the courts to determine based on the circumstances that they'd be looking at for any particular individual cases.
Right. Let me just move on to the issue of how we control where dogs are and how dogs are controlled. And I raised with the previous panel the issue that access to land under land reform legislation is only where it's responsible access. And therefore, the question is, would a dog that's not on a lead be automatically irresponsible adjacent to livestock? It's also fair to say the previous panel, in particular Charlie Adams, said that even on a lead it can be irresponsible for a dog on a lead to be adjacent to some livestock. So is it an issue about the use to which land's being put being part of whether we should seek to penalise people who take their dog or let their dog near to livestock?
Sorry, just to clarify, do you mean like in relation to the access code, or?
I was referring to the access code in relation to whether if you have a dog that's off the lead, you're being irresponsible and therefore not entitled to take access under that basis. But I'm making a broader point, Minister, as well. And forgive me for conflating two perhaps slightly different issues. A broader point about whether the dogs and people taking dogs onto land should simply be banned from agricultural land. And if they were, how would they know it was agricultural land?
I think that is part of the issue. Does everybody know their rights and responsibilities as part of the access code and what they are permitted and what they wouldn't be permitted to do? Yes, so I think that is a very valid point. I don't think probably everybody would necessarily be aware, and I do think some of the incidents that we may have seen of livestock worrying so far may have been from sheer, from ignorance rather than out of malice. Not that that excuses it. Because I do think people have a responsibility to make sure that they know their rights when they're out and about. So I know that Nature Scott have done a lot of work in the access code and in relation to education, particularly given some of the issues that we've seen during the course of the pandemic. And I think some of the work they've done on the access code and trying to promote awareness of that, I think they'd seen an extra 250,000 hits to their website, which is quite something. So, but I don't know. So I think it is more about how do we inform people about what they should be doing and how that is managed, because obviously it is a difficult thing to police when people are out in the country. So it's like, yeah, how do we get that balance right with it effectively? But I do think education is a key point of that, and making sure people are aware of their responsibilities and what they should be doing. I don't think it's necessarily the case that all people should necessarily be banned from accessing agricultural land, full stop. I don't know if that was something that you had highlighted there in your question.
Well, this is my final point, Minister. I think I'm simply reflecting some of the evidence that's come to the committee. But finally, you use the word rights about the person with the dog. I wonder if you would agree that it would be appropriate for education to focus on the obligations that people with dogs in the countryside have to those who are making use of the countryside to have livestock on there. In other words, rights only come if you respect the obligations that come with exercising that right. I just invite you to agree that that would be the case, and then back to you, Convener.
Minister. Oh yeah, absolutely, I would agree with that.
Oh, a very short answer. Almost caught me off guard there, and so we'll go to the next question, which is from Peter Chapman. Peter.
Thanks, Convener. Morning, Minister. The bill speaks about using vets to gather evidence. I mean, I've got a very simple question. Who will pay where a vet is called to examine a dog in the case of livestock worrying? And who will be expected to cover the costs? And how will they be recovered if the farmer or the vet pays in the first instance?
Minister.
I think when it comes to the costs of investigation, that would probably have to be borne initially by that investigatory body. And I think the issue of whether those costs could be should be recouped from an offender, I think that is a point that we would have to give greater consideration to. I mean, I know that it's been raised in previous evidence with the committee. I think it was from Inspector Drawn when he's given evidence. And he talked of one incident where I think somebody had been convicted of livestock worrying, and they had been granted a compensation order. But then I think it had also been raised in the same session of evidence that only 9% of farmers that have been affected by a livestock attack or a livestock worrying incident have received compensation. So there are clearly a lot of people who aren't able to, for one reason or another, recoup their costs. And I think that there are means by which people could go about seeking compensation. So it really just, so I think the main question that comes out of that for me, and that has come out of the evidence, is to look at, well, why is it that only 9% are able to get the compensation, and are there issues around that?
Yeah, well, it is a big issue. I think we are adding costs to the whole procedure. You know, rightly so, to get a conviction possibly. But the cost is something we need to address. And the other thing we need to address is that not all vets would be qualified or would have the resources to do this work. So, will there be standard operating procedures for vets carrying out forensic examinations, and how will training for examination and evidence handling be provided to the veterinary community?
I mean, I think there could well be instances of taking of evidence that probably wouldn't be removed or could well be part of what vets currently undertake in relation to their care for animals at the moment. So it may not require too much, but I think these are definitely conversations that I'd like to have. I haven't discussed this with any of the veterinary associations to get their opinions on that. But I do think that that's something that we would have to discuss with them to see if there would be extra training required. But I think, especially when it came to like the taking of blood samples or things like that, that would be something that vets would be capable of doing at the moment. But again, that's something that could be considered further. Yeah,
and just one final point on this whole thing is the question of consent. For a vet to examine a dog, will the police be allowed to give consent for that examination, or does the owner have to give consent for that examination to take place?
In terms of the bill as it's proposed, the legal authority to have a dog examined would rest with the constable or the inspector who sees the dog, and where there is that reasonable cause to that it's been involved in a livestock attack or a worrying incident.
Okay, I'm fine, thank you.
Minister, a quick question, if I may, on that particular issue. If there is an incident of livestock worrying and a vet's called out to treat the animals in question, it will be normally the vet that the farmer uses to treat his livestock, or her livestock, and therefore the vet will know the animals well. And then it may be that vet that is asked to examine the dog, which may cause all sorts of conflicts of interest when it comes to a prosecution. Do you see there's ways around that, or do you see that that isn't really an issue?
Again, that's something I'd probably have to give greater consideration to, because again, in terms of the bill as it is, the legal authority would rest with the constable inspector. So I imagine that they may have to be present for that to be the case, but I don't know if officials have any further information or can offer any greater clarification on that. I'll look to Phil.
I don't know if any... Phil, do you want to come in? You look as though you're prepping yourself.
I'm getting feedback on it's about I mean, it would be the issue of conflict, but there's also the possibility that in remoter areas there would be relatively few vets, and it sounds like there would be costs involved in taking a dog to a vet at a further distance.
Okay. I think, Minister, that may be something to ponder on a little bit longer after this. I'm going to come to the next question, which are from Mike Rumbles. Mike.
Good morning, Minister. I've got lots of questions. The first one is really on Section 5 of the bill, inspecting bodies and inspectors. As the Minister will know, it says in the bill the Scottish ministers may, by regulations, authorise one or more persons, organisations or bodies to appoint inspectors for the purpose of this Act. And that's quite different, I think, to the Welfare and Farmed Animals Act of 2006. And there seems to be some controversy about this because it would seem to give an awful lot of power to appointed inspectors. So I'd like to know what would the Scottish ministers think would be suitable organisations or persons to appoint them? And there seemed from our previous witnesses an issue at the very least, if we go down this route with this bill, appointing inspectors in addition to the police constables, there should be a training system and perhaps a certification system if you go down that route. So at the moment, the way the bill is written, it sounds as though the Minister would appoint a body who would appoint inspectors, and there wouldn't necessarily be any training or certification.
Again, that's a point that we would really have to consider further as well, as to whether we would look to support that model as it's proposed in the bill, or adopt the model that we already have for the appointment of animal welfare inspectors, which is in Part 2 of the Animal Health 2006. And that is whereby Scottish ministers directly appoint inspectors and other bodies that don't have an official role in the appointment process. So I think, so again, that's something that we are giving consideration to at the moment, but we do have that alternative process, which I think is effective at the moment in relation to that. In relation to who any other potential bodies might be, I think there are probably only a limited number of people it could be, but again, we would just have to give further consideration to that, and further consideration would definitely be needed, as well as further discussions with the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. But I do think that it would be probably a given, because it would definitely be beneficial for anybody that was appointed in those respective areas, or whoever those inspectors might be, that first of all they establish protocols with the police, and that yeah, we would, depending on who they would be as well, that's when we'd look to consider what training may be most appropriate for them.
Thanks for that, Minister. I also wanted to point to you that we got from the previous panel of witnesses that there was also a view from them that perhaps if you do appoint inspectors, rather than have the focus on the police and a properly resourced police service to deal with it, that the severity of the crime, if I can put it that way, might be diminished if you have several different organisations, local authorities or whoever, private organisations, and the police involved. There was a view, I think I'm saying this correctly, from them, that it might be better just to focus on a properly resourced police effort to do this, because it is, they all said, a very serious crime, and they're worried about perhaps the problems of too many people involved in this.
Oh yeah, I can absolutely understand why that point was raised, because I think that we see similar issues when it comes to wildlife crime, for example, and I think especially the areas where livestock attacks take place, and the nature of wildlife crime it's in rural areas. But I do think that the police will always have a finite resource that they'll be able to apply for it. I understand what you mean in relation to that. It can be confusing in relation to, well, who would be the appropriate body, or who would be the appropriate body for someone to contact. But again, I think with a lot of organisations right now, they don't work in isolation. When I talked about the dog control notices previously, I talked about the working protocols that we have with local authorities and with Police Scotland, trying to see how we can improve that and ensure there is there is joint up working there. And we have similar arrangements in place. And we're, again, through the Animals and Wildlife Act that was just passed earlier this year, we were looking at a better intelligence sharing between the SSPCA and Police Scotland too, because obviously they have to work together quite closely. The SSPCA can be called out to wildlife incidents where it's appropriate for the police to be involved. But of course, all these bodies have very distinct powers. So I think it's important that all of that is taken into consideration when looking at who would be the most appropriate authority to have in place. But I do think, regardless of whether that would be the police or other inspecting bodies, it's the protocols and how they work together, how they share information, that would be important to get right.
Should I move on to my next question, or do you want to?
No, Mike, you're in charge.
Right, okay,
virtually.
Right. I'd like to move on to section 4 of the bill, which is also giving me some concern, as well as section 5. The power to authorise entry, search and seizure. Now, this bill is a departure, as far as I understand it, from the established legal norms in Scots law, because, as the Minister will be aware, in normal everyday general principles, a police constable cannot enter a property or premises in the hope of searching for evidence. You take any issue like that to a sheriff or a justice of the peace to obtain a search warrant, and then you can enter those premises. And that in our, if I may say so, liberal democratic society, that is the safeguard that we have in here. Now, this bill, as is written in section 4, allows that to be, if I can put it this way, circumvented. It does actually say this subsection is complied with if admission to the premises had been refused, or such a refusal may be reasonably expected, or the subsection is complied with if premises are unoccupied or the occupier is temporarily absent. That's a huge difference from our normal established way of policing, is it not?
Well, I do think there are some other similarities in other pieces of legislation. So it's currently the case for constables and inspectors under paragraph 4, section Schedule 1 of the Animal Health and Welfare Act 2006 in connection with the investigation of certain animal welfare offences. So I don't think it would be such a massive departure away from that, as it's been intimated, because like I say, we do have these similar powers in other pieces of legislation, and that can be done, that is primarily done in relation to concern over the welfare of an animal. And I would say that the proposals in the bill don't extend to the search of domestic premises without a warrant. And it's obviously the Crown Office who establish whether other approaches have been considered prior to seeking that warrant too. So I do think that I understand the members' concern about that and why there would be concern about that. And again, it has to be fully considered. But I would say that there are those similar powers there.
Can I just say, I think the Minister misunderstands the point I'm making, because I'm fully aware of if a police constable in general feels that there is a crime underway or happening, as with animal welfare, neglect, anything that's a criminal offence, he has the power to enter premises in general principles of Scots law. This is not that. If a crime was committed somewhere else, that animal is not, that crime, that person is not actually committing an offence at the time, or there is likely to commit an offence. So there is a major difference in law as to those two, that Act of Parliament, which I fully understand, and what is proposed in this bill, because what is proposed in the bill does give a departure from the norm of search and a constable or indeed an inspector being given the power to search without a warrant.
Oh yeah, and I mean, as I said just towards the end of my statement as well, I mean, it was primarily the provisions in this part of the bill that we really wanted to consider further, as well as the appointment of inspectors via authorising a body to appoint them, because they do need further consideration, and that's where we would be having discussions with the Crown Office in due course.
Okay, Mike, is that you?
Yeah, thank you, and thank the Minister.
Thank you, Mike. The next questions are going to be from Oliver Mundell. Oliver.
Thank you, Convener. The questions I was going to cover primarily, I think, been covered, but I just wondered, that was the second time I think I heard the Minister say that talk about having further discussions with the Crown Office. Does that mean that there's been discussions already, and have they raised any concerns about how the bill is currently drafted?
No, as I say, the discussions are really ongoing with that, because it's not an exact like-for-like example, but I don't know, the member will probably be aware of discussions that we had in the Act about increasing, the potential for increasing the powers that were available for the SSPCA. And we are still in the midst of trying to establish a task force to consider that specific issue, because I think it could often have been portrayed as if it was quite a simple thing to just increase powers, but it wasn't as simple as that, and it was obviously an area that could have implications for the SSPCA, as well as for the investigation of crime and the powers that are that are held by the Crown Office and by the police. So that's why we set up a task force to really try and really tease out a lot of those issues, and that work is still due to start on that. So while this situation isn't exactly the same, there are issues within that again we haven't been able to fully resolve yet or fully investigate. So that's really why I say that we are continuing discussions with the Crown Office, and we will have those discussions to really try and bottom out where the issues are.
And just following up on that, given that experience, does it not put you off as a government going down the same approach on this bill? And you know, I'd be concerned personally that that kind of process would slow down, you know, this legislation coming fully into force. And I think the people who've been waiting, you know, many years to see this legislation updated would rather see the police given the power straight away to get on with tackling this. And I say that particularly given the comments we heard in the last panel, where people suggested that, you know, sometimes the police don't see this as being as much of a priority as wildlife crime. So I'd be concerned that that kind of process could delay this legislation or create confusion around it. Is that something you'd take into consideration?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because again, this isn't anything. I'm not suggesting that, or we certainly don't want to do anything to impede the progress of this bill, because I do think it is vitally important, and that's why we support the bill, because I think it actually gives livestock attacks the seriousness with which they should be recognised. And so it's very positive in that respect, and we want to make sure that that progresses and that would be implemented. But again, I only raised that example just to highlight some of the issues that we face. But again, I'm not comparing like with that situation and with what's proposed here in the bill. I only use that as a point of just to highlight how some of these issues can be quite complex. But I would hope that once we have those discussions with the Crown Office, we would be able to progress with that again, just get to the bottom of the issues and see where those are, and again, not hold up this process and progress with it as we can, because again, the two situations are different, and I was only using that as an example to highlight how we've dealt with it in other areas.
Thanks. And just one final question, Convener, just returning to vets briefly. In a previous evidence session, we heard a suggestion that the SRUC's SAC vets might be able to be used because I think they already do some work for the Scottish Government and Police Scotland in other areas, and it's just again whether that's something you would explore as an option to try and iron out some of the resourcing issues for vets.
I'd be certainly be happy to look into that and get back to the committee with more detail.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. We're going to move on now to the Deputy Convener, Maureen Watt, for some questions. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. Just to follow on in terms of education and raising awareness, would it be the Scottish Government's intention to accompany any new legislation with increased awareness raising and education campaigns for preventing livestock worrying among dog owners and land managers?
Minister.
Thank you. I know that that's a massive point that's been raised consistently throughout all the evidence that the committee's taken in the case of education awareness raising, because I do think that when you introduce especially new penalties, and it's important that people are aware of any new pieces of legislation that are passed and the impacts that may have. So again, we would just have to give further consideration to that as we move forward, because we have, I know that there's a lot of work being done by other organisations, so it would be good to have those discussions with them as well to see how we can perhaps work with them when it comes to that education and awareness raising. For example, we've been working with the SSPCA over the past 2 years and looking to do that again this year about raising awareness of how to buy a puppy safely, because we know that that's a massive issue. So if we've already got campaigns like that, it would make sense to look at, right, is there a way that we can work that? And obviously this is an area that cuts across portfolios too, so I'm sure the Minister for Safety is dealing with dog control notices probably wouldn't be too happy with me committing all of her budget to a marketing campaign for that either. So that's definitely something that we would have to consider when the legislation is passed. But it's definitely an important point, especially because, I mean, I talked about buying a puppy safely there, and I think that we are seeing, and I think this kind of feeds into the dog control element, that, you know, we are, especially during the course of the pandemic, seen an increase in I'm sure everybody will have heard the news about the cost of how much puppies are now, but also the demand has completely gone up, because I think with people relatively generally being at home more, they've looked to buy a puppy and to get themselves a pet. But I think that, you know, from a discussion I had with some animal welfare charities just within the past few weeks, I think we're already starting to see issues arise as a result of that, because I think not everybody realises the responsibilities that then come with owning that animal. And it's not a temporary thing, that when you take a puppy or you decide that you're going to take a pet, you have that pet for, well, it should be for life, and you should be looking after that properly. And I think that we could see more issues potentially in relation to the behaviour of animals, given the sheer numbers of people that are taking on more pets, and also the fact that there is less access now to some of the education and training that had been done by a lot of animal welfare organisations previously to the pandemic, even though a lot of that is happening again now and happening virtually. But yeah, it's a very important point.
Now, Minister, I think one of your officials wants to come in. Jim Wilson, I think, wants to come in. If you're happy to let him in, I'm very happy to hear what he's got to add to it. Way betide you if you say no afterwards, I suspect. Jim.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'll be brief, just to highlight some recent activity that we actually had some engagement with Scottish Government Justice Communications around using social media platforms, raising awareness of dog control. So we recently done some stuff on Twitter, which was basically promoting the Control of Dogs Act 2010, highlighting the importance of keeping dogs under control. So the short video clip was viewed 51,000 times, so I think that's decent. We did a second clip, which was encouraging citizens to actually report any issues regarding out-of-control dogs to local authorities. That was viewed 8,230 times the last time I checked. And we've done a little bit of stuff on Facebook as well. So a fairly modest cost, we were actually able to just get some key messages out there. And I do appreciate that in terms of marketing resources generally at the moment, that, you know, they will be heavily focused in terms of dealing with COVID. But, you know, there may be future opportunities to have a look at other awareness raising opportunities. And that's certainly something that the Scottish Government-led working group is looking at, to look at what other key enforcement agencies can actually do to also promote responsible dog ownership across the country.
Thank you, Jim, for that. Now, I think Christine Graham, I think you wanted to come in at this stage, did you? Christine.
Well, yes, thank you very much, Convener. Just a couple of points, and I do accept what you say about marketing resources being required for very many COVID things at the moment, although of course more people are going in the outdoors and taking their dogs, and perhaps there's a quid pro quo there about, you know, advertising if this goes through, including the control of dogs and this legislation. But I want to approach and ask you a question about the database, which I think was raised by Peter Chapman. All dogs in Scotland should be microchipped. And I remember at the audit committee when I had raised the issue of the database for animals, for dogs, had a dog control notice under the Control of Dogs Scotland Act, which was mine. And I seem to remember, being unfair to say it's absolutely the case, that the Minister, Ash Denham, said she would look at this national database. Now, it seemed to me to be a good idea that if this legislation comes in, they can check whether this dog's already got a dog control notice and this is a further offence, and link the two together. Can I ask if the Minister will discuss this with the Justice Minister?
I'd be happy to discuss that further with the Minister for Community Safety, but in relation to a national notice database, I believe that is that's work that's being taken forward, and that is what's being considered at the moment. I don't know if Jim has any further detail on that he'd like to add.
Just I'll be brief again. It's something that's been looked at by the working group, and very recently, it was actually the 20th of August when the Minister for Community Safety and I appeared before the Public Audit Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee. The database was raised. So we have had some exploratory conversations with the Improvement Service, Police Scotland and local authorities around the opportunities to actually seek or to actually create such a system. The Minister highlighted an earlier consultation from September to January this year that looked into the operational effectiveness of the Control of Dogs Act 2010. And there was a specific question posed on the dog control database, and there was a high percentage of those who responded who thought that this was a good idea. It would provide and become a useful enforcement tool for local authorities, where you might have an individual that's been served with a dog control notice that might move house, and that person might move into a different local authority area. It's also worthwhile highlighting that we have to recognise that under Article 36(4) there is a requirement to engage with the regulator around any statutory work that's been undertaken. So I know that Christine Graham will recall with some fondness that the 2010 Act and ultimately the need to ensure that information sharing is obviously considered between the key enforcement agencies, but we want to ensure that the Information Commissioner's Office is actually part of these conversations going forward as well. And just a final point, and really just relates to the actual database, it is quite restricted in terms of what could be held, so it would be actually information on a dog control notice that would be held on a national database. However, we would be open to the opportunities to actually look at further legislative change. So in order for more information on dog control to be held in such a system, but the key point to make that I certainly made with the Improvement Service, if they agree to take on this project and further conversations are planned at the end of this month, is that we have to ensure that any systems that are being developed are actually future-proofed to ensure that the digital tools can actually support any current plans or policy changes that might be on the horizon, whether that's through legislative means. So it's just to stress that, in terms of the database, it's quite limited to holding information on dog control notices, but there may well be opportunities for such a system to do more in the future, but we need to look at a legislative change to achieve that.
Thank you, Jim. Christine, I think you want to come back.
Yeah, I'm not going to focus on my bill because this is about other legislation, but do you agree that it would assist in prosecutions under this legislation? If there were that database, it might provide corroboration that we had a reckless owner already there. It's going to be quite hard to get corroboration where these things may take, well, they will take place where there's nobody about. So that if somebody reports that the animal's identified and there's already a dog control notice, you have an additional tool to establish that this is an owner who is not looking after the dog properly and it's out of control and has perhaps committed this additional offence under this legislation. I was looking at his corroboration.
A very good point that Christine Graham just made, and I think it's useful to highlight that there, of course, are linkages between issues that emerge under the Control of Dogs Act 2010 and also issues that emerge under the Dangerous Dogs Act 1991. And one of the issues that we will be looking at in relation to that second review that will look at the Dangerous Dogs Act legislation actually would explore the challenges of this concern that was raised by a number of witnesses who gave evidence at the Public Audit Committee on this issue around reasonable apprehension. So an owner maybe not knowing that their dog might be likely, or it could be, depends on the circumstances, but there could be issues in terms of achieving successful prosecutions because of that reasonable apprehension argument. So that's something that needs to be very carefully looked at in terms of that consultation. But I would agree with Christine Graham that I do think that there would be opportunities for the database to actually be accessed by Police Scotland, and I can confirm that when we had one of the working group conversations, that Police Scotland can recognise the benefit of actually receiving that type of information and intelligence from local authorities that could well support other investigations or matters that could fall under the actual 1991 Act.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim. I'm now going to bring in Emma Harper with a couple of questions, and then I've got one at the end. So, Emma, whose bill it is, the floor is yours, as it were.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister and Phil and Jim. Thank you for giving evidence so far, and again, I thank the committee members for their scrutiny of the bill. I'm pleased that the government supports the general principles of updating this 67-year-old legislation. It's a question about the police, and the fact that, for me, the police are the ones who would take the lead in this any investigation. So, pardon the phrase, but that would be my goal. And supporting them might be other investigating bodies, such as local authority agents. I used the UEFA European Championship Scotland bill to basically lift that language that was approved, which talks about in section 19 and 20, including language of the power to enter and search and use of reasonable force. So that was the language that I used because it was already passed. But and the intention was that if we had a latchkey dog that was seized in a field, that somebody could then take that dog and place it in a holding pen or a place.
Emma,
so
Emma,
Yeah.
I'm giving you quite a lot of leniency. I'm not going to give you any more leniency to expand the bill. Can I ask you to focus and ask your question to the Minister? Because I think you'll get a chance to explain your bill when you come in front of the committee. Sorry to be interrupting you.
No, that's fine. I'm just wondering if the Minister has thoughts whether that needs to be in primary legislation or in the bill on the face of the bill, or can I use that in further regulation about assigning other people's powers?
Minister.
Again, that's a point that we're given consideration to at the moment, and how best that might operate, because I completely understand what the member's trying to do with that provision. And like you say, having the police as the primary investigating body, but it's more about having potentially others to assist in that capacity, or having organisations work together. And again, we have other examples of where that happens. But again, we just want to have that full discussion with the Crown Office to see if there are any potential issues there, and to iron that out. But I completely understand what the member is trying to do with that provision in the bill, because it's really just trying to make sure that the police and inspectors have the powers available to them to be able to thoroughly investigate these incidents.
Thank you. Emma, do you have a further question?
Not really. I will save it for future, because it might take more of a preamble in order to get the information. So I'm quite happy, Convener. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that. Now, Minister, I have a question, if I may. Is that during the course of the evidence sessions on all the panels so far, the issue of the value of livestock has been raised, and I mean, you'll know that livestock can vary in value and can be quite expensive for sheep and rams particularly. I wonder if you feel the compensation element is given enough consideration in the bill, and whether you think there was some suggestion that it might be appropriate for owners of dogs to have insurance to cover any liability. You know, say, for example, a £20,000 ram, or I think Stewart suggested 300,000 might, in extreme circumstances, owe to be able to sell something for that value. I haven't achieved it yet, but then I don't have sheep. So do you think insurance is something that we should consider along with compensation?
I think that farmers should be insured for those incidents. But again, I think it comes back to a response. May have been Colin Smith's question somewhere near the start of the session. But it's really just about, again, you'd already heard in evidence that one case that had been highlighted where compensation had been, there was a compensation order that had been granted in that case. But again, there is that statistic that only 9% of farmers actually receive compensation. So I think that, again, that's an issue that I would want to give further consideration to, because I think that we could well have all the tools available to us when it comes to compensation. Obviously, there's the civil route for that process as well, but it's worth looking at, right, well, if we have these routes available, if they're not working, why is that? And what are the reasons behind that, so that we can fully get to the bottom of it, because it is working for some, but clearly not working for a lot of people.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. I'm just looking around the committee. I don't see that there's any other questions at this stage. So, Minister, I'd like to thank you and your team for giving evidence in this part of our meeting. And I'm now going to move on to the agenda item 2, which is the European Withdrawal Act 2018. We have received consent notifications in relation to 2 UK statutory instruments as detailed on the agenda. These instruments are being laid in the UK Parliament in relation to the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. Now, one of the statutory instruments, the Fertiliser Ammonium Nitrate Material Regulations, has already been made. Therefore, the committee is being asked to scrutinise the UK SI protocol retrospectively. This goes outside the protocol that such instruments are normally considered under and does not give the committee the usual 28 days to consider it. As such, the committee has been advised that it can only note the Scottish Government it has given consent. And the Scottish Government has also provided further clarification in writing on the agricultural payments, miscellaneous amendments, EU Exit Regulations 2020, and this has been circulated to members on our website. I would invite members if they want to make any comments, but before I do, I have to say, as convener of this committee, to be given an SI to scrutinise after it has been laid without being given due time for the committee to consider it before it is laid is fundamentally wrong, in my opinion. And I think it should be avoided. So I would just ask at this stage if there's any members of the committee wish to make comment on any of the SIs. Stewart, I think you want to make a comment.
Very simply to endorse the comments that you've just made, convener, and to indicate that I think you're absolutely right in what you've said. Thank you.
Deputy Convener Maureen Moore.
Thank you, Convener. I just wondered in terms of, well, especially the fertilisers and ammonium nitrate material regulations, whether, I'm just reading the purpose, whether any of the stuff contained in this will be affected by the Internal Markets Bill.
We can certainly ask that as a question as part of the notes that we submit. Does anyone else wish to make comment? Sorry, the only person I can see on the screen is Stewart, so I'm assuming that no one else does. So does the committee agree to note that the Scottish Government has given its consent for the fertilisers and ammonium nitrate material amendment, and the instrument has now been made? And does it also note that we should write, as the Deputy Convener suggested, and also to note my concern as the Convener of the committee on your behalf, that it seems to be wrong to be looking at this in retrospect? We are agreed. As that has been agreed, we will now go into private session. Thank you.